All right. Welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book today, we got to check out Gundam Wing, specifically episode 7. Now, this is a pivotal episode in the series, and for a couple of reasons. It's kind of like the turning point of the revolution that this guy Trey's is trying to set up, and he's really playing the Hegelian dialectic like very good in this episode. Now, basically, their strategy, the what's it called, Rockefeller Corporation strategy, who Trey is the leader of or whatever, is basically to do a reverse false flag. Now, this is an interesting strategy, the reverse false flag, because basically what he does is he gets one group of good guys to fight another group of good guys by confusing the Gundams basically into thinking that the people that want peace are in a plane and that they're actually the bad guys. And then so he gets one set of good guys to attack another set of good guys and then leaves the remaining only like politicians left are the guys that also want to do a war. And then after it also has the useful idiot thing in there too, because then after they get the guys to agree to do the war, then they also get rid of them also. So that they're the only people left. It's like serious Hegelian dialectic, Machiavellian thing where you think they're working with you. No, they're only working for themselves. That's it. They're going to get rid of you as soon as you help them get rid of the other people. So we'll just watch a quick clip of it so that the useful idiots can kind of see what's going to happen to them after they help stage the revolution that they think they're going to be a part of.
We'll leave right after them. That's the one.
See, they lazed or marked the plane as an enemy plane, even though it was carrying the guys that wanted to sign the peace treaty and disarm.
It's an unfortunate coincidence, but I won't let it obstruct our peace proposal.
Marshal!
What on earth? Now, young man, don't be foolish.
Mission accomplished.
Bruh. The fact that he says mission accomplished when he fails the mission every time. And he says it so confidently. He's just so American. He's so American, it's ridiculous. He's like, mission accomplished. He just blew up the good guys.
What have they done? Marshal Noventa!
Thanks for those missiles earlier, buddy. Now I'll return the favor.
See, this part's kind of confusing because basically when they got sent to Earth, they all got sent separately. So even though they're on the same mission from the Project Paperclip mad scientist, they don't know that they're supposed to be working together at this point. So they're actually fighting each other.
Cut it out, you guys! Haven't you guys
guys gotten tired of these meaningless battles yet?
What do you mean?
Don't you guys realize? You've all been lured right into Oz's devious little trap.
Wait, what?
Check out the Alliance's report. You guys just wiped out the Alliance's pacifists.
Impossible.
This is the colony's declaration of war against us. We were just discussing plans for peace talks with the colonies today. Marshal Noventa was at the center of these plans, and he's been assassinated. He was killed by the colony's invading mobile suits. I repeat, this was a brutal invasion by the colonies.
They got it all on video too, right? It's just perfect. Like they got the Gundam blowing up the thing and they blew up the peacemakers. So it's like they just perfectly played that.
We will not yield to the colonies. We must fight them to the bitter end.
Very nicely done, General Septim. We won't be needing you any further.
What?
A magnificent performance. It truly is a pity you had to leave the stage so early.
Like he wasn't gonna die from the helicopter ride. Alright. Let's get into the book. See, that's what happens to the useful idiots, right? You think they're gonna do the revolution with you, and then no, they throw you out the plane right after they throw the other guys out the plane. Alright. So here we go. World War II, The Tide of Aggression, 1939 to 1941. We're on page 721. The Nazi Attack on Soviet Russia, 1941 to 1942. In planning his attack on Soviet Russia, Hitler used the customary German strategic concepts. These gave priority to the destruction of enemy armies over the seizure and occupation of enemy territory and resources. This destruction was to be achieved, and quickly achieved according to Hitler, in a series of gigantic pincer movements of the double-arm type, which had worked so well against Poland in 1939. In these operations, a huge outer pincers of armored division spearheads and a simultaneous but smaller inner pincers of infantry division columns would enclose a mass of enemy troops, the armored pincers cutting a large segment of these off from their supplies and communications, while the infantry columns would slice up the enclosed mass of enemy forces into smaller masses willing to surrender. This method was used again and again with extraordinary success against the Soviet armies after June 1941, enclosing and frequently capturing hundreds of thousands of Russians at a time. But the very size of the operation used up Nazi men, material, and above all time, without inflicting any fatal blow on the Soviet capacity to resist. Because of these German strategic ideas, no geographical objectives were given primary priority in the German plans. Secondary priority was given, at Hitler's insistence, to the capture of Leningrad in the north and to the capture of Kiev and the Caucasus to the south. These geographical objectives were set in order to link up with the Finns and cut the Murmansk Railway in the north, and to capture, or at least cut off from Russian armies, the Soviet oil centers in the south. The capture of Moscow was, by Hitler's direct orders, given only tertiary priority in the German strategic plans. The German generals disagreed with Hitler's geographic conceptions and insisted that Moscow be made the chief geographic goal of the German advance because it was the vital railroad center of European Russia. It was also an important industrial center and contained the heart and brain of the whole Soviet autocracy. Its capture would, according to the generals, cripple Russia's ability to shift troops and supplies north and south and would thus make it possible to isolate, for easier conquest, the Leningrad or Kiev fronts. Moreover, its capture would paralyze the over-centralized system of Soviet tyranny and strike such a blow to Bolshevik prestige that it would probably be unable to survive. In the first 3 months of the campaign of 1941 and for all of the campaign of 1942, Hitler resisted the pressure from his generals and insisted that the maximum German effort should be devoted to the two areas originally set in the north and south. Only in September 1941, when it was too late for a successful assault on Moscow, did Hitler recognize that his own geographic objectives could not be achieved, with the result that he fell back on his general's advice for an attack on Moscow. This dispersal and shifting of geographic objectives, combined with German inability to destroy the Soviet armies completely, brought Germany to the point which Hitler had always insisted must be avoided above all else: a two-front war of attrition by Germany, which was nowhere near total economic mobilization. German authorities estimated that Russia had over 200 divisions, of which 30 to 35 were in the Far East, with 8,000 aircraft of diverse quality, 15,000 tanks, mostly light or obsolescent. On the European front, they expected to encounter 125 infantry, 25 cavalry, 25 motorized, and at least 5 armored divisions. Against these Russian forces, Hitler planned to hurl 141 German and 33 satellite Finnish, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, Slovak, and Croat divisions. The German forces included 19 half-sized armored divisions with 3,200 tanks, 14 motorized divisions, and 3 air fleets with 2,000 planes. These forces were organized into 3 army groups: Northern, Central, and Southern, aiming in the general direction of Leningrad, 500 miles away, Moscow, 750 miles, and the lower Volga, Stalingrad, 800 miles away. Each army group consisted of infantry and panzer armies placed alternately across the front in order to operate the double claw pincer movements we have mentioned. The whole German front from north to south had 7 infantry armies and 4 panzer armies organized in this alternating fashion, with 2 infantry armies forming each end of the line, and the satellite forces on the extreme flanks, Finns to the north, the others to the south. The Soviet Union was warned of the impending Nazi attack from Washington to London, as well as by its own spies, and had the exact date of the assault almost as soon as it was set in Berlin. An anti-Nazi German in Berlin gave a copy of Hitler's secret directive for Operation Barbarossa to the American commercial attaché within 3 weeks of its formulation. This was sent to the Kremlin by Secretary of State Hull early in March 1941. All these helpful moves were received with ill grace by the Soviet leaders, and those who offered them were treated as troublemakers. Moscow made no effort to escape the Nazi pincers by withdrawing its forces from their exposed frontier positions, but continued to hope that its abject economic collaboration with Hitler would lead him to cancel the attack orders in recognition of the fact that he could obtain more in an economic sense from collaborating in peace than from conquest in war. This hope was futile because Hitler had such a gigantic disrespect for Russia's fighting powers that he expected a complete German victory in about 6 weeks. So convinced was Hitler on this point that he flatly rejected in June, again in July, and once again in August, suggestions from the chief of the Great General Staff that any preparations be made for fighting in winter. For this refusal, Germany was to suffer bitterly. Hitler's estimates about the weakness of the Soviet armies and the brevity of the approaching campaign were generally shared by military men throughout the world. In the United States, Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall believed that Germany would be victorious in 6 weeks. The Nazi army sprang forward at dawn on Sunday, June 22, 1941. At the end of 5 days, 2 envelopments had been closed, and on the following day a third was completed. In these pockets there were such large Russian forces that the perimeters could not be closed completely, and broken Russian units escaped through the German lines. Nevertheless, from these pockets were taken 2,809 prisoners, 2,500 tanks, 1,000 cannons. By July 25th, several more encirclements had been completed on the Central Front, yielding 185,000 prisoners with 2,000 tanks and 2,000 guns. At this point, a crisis arose in the German High Command. All the great successes we have mentioned were on the Central Front, while the Northern and Southern fronts, which Hitler wanted emphasized, were advancing much more slowly. This resulted from the fact that Hitler's generals did not share the Führer's strategic plans and had disposed the German forces so that, in effect, they overruled his directives and gave preponderance to their own goal, the capture of Moscow. For this reason, they had given 2 of their 4 panzer armies to Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center, and 1 to each of the other army groups. Since the Russians had massed their strength in the south, German Army Group South under Gerhard von Rundstedt had only 800 tanks, while his Soviet opponent, Marshal Esem Boudinny, had 2,000. The brilliant success of the German Army Group Center led the German General Staff and Hitler to change their minds, but in opposite directions. The weakness of the Soviet defense persuaded Bock to adopt a plan advanced by Guderian that Army Group Center abandon further efforts at pincer encirclements and send its armored units on a straight, all-out drive to Moscow, 100 miles away. About the same time, Hitler decided to strengthen the advance of Army Group North and South by directing the efforts of the 2 panzer armies of Army Group Center away from their own front and onto the fronts of the 2 flanking army groups. This would have left Army Group Center with infantry forces only, thus slowing its advance and restricting its operations to tactical mopping up activities, but it would have increased the ability of the flanking army groups to close pincer envelopments by giving each of them the use of 2 panzer armies. By Directive Number 33, on July 19th, Hitler issued orders for this change. Although the generals resisted and stalled in carrying out these instructions, the advance on Moscow was broken. General Franz Halder wrote in his diary on July 26th, "The Führer's analysis, which at many points is unjustly critical of the field command, indicates a complete break with the strategy of large operational conception. You cannot beat the Russians with operational successes, he argues, because they simply do not know when they are defeated. On that account, it will be necessary to destroy them bit by bit in small encircling actions of purely tactical character. Against these ideas of Hitler's generals argued for weeks in vain. On August 21st, Hitler issued Directive Number 34. It began, "The proposals of the Army High Command for the continuance of operations in the East, dated August 18th, do not conform to my intentions. The principal object is not the capture of Moscow. In place of this, it set the following objectives: to seize the Crimea and Donbass coal mines, to cut off the Caucasian oil supplies, to isolate Leningrad, and to make direct contact with the Finns." As a consequence of the shift of emphasis to the south, German Army Group South completed a colossal envelopment of East Kiev August 24th through September 21st. In a great bag 200 miles wide, the Germans captured 665,000 prisoners with 3,700 cannons and 800 tanks. Hitler called this the greatest battle in the history of the world. His chief of staff called it the greatest strategic blunder of the Eastern Campaign. At this point in the campaign, a curious phenomenon appeared. Large numbers of anti-Stalinist Russians began to surrender the Nazis. Most of these were Ukrainians, and the majority were eager to fight with the Nazis against the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union. If the Nazis had been willing to cooperate with this movement and to treat these deserters in a decent fashion, it is extremely likely that the flood of Russian deserters would have become an overwhelming torrent and the Moscow regime would have collapsed. Instead, the Nazis, led by Hitler, resolutely refused to adopt the role of liberator of the Slavs and instead insisted on playing the role of annihilator of the Slavs. The arrogance, sadism, and racism of the Nazi system soon presented itself in a form as hateful to the average Slav as Stalinism itself. As soon as the conquering German armies seized Soviet territory, various Nazi and satellite organizations of exploitation, of enslavement, and of extermination moved in, led by the SS. Prisoners of war and civilians were rounded up by the millions and deported to German slave labor camps, where they were starved, frozen, and beaten into subhuman derelicts at the very time that they were expected to work 15 or more hours a day on Nazi war production. Those inhabitants of conquered areas who escaped deportation or imprisonment generally were deprived of most of their possessions, especially of their food stores and livestock. All industrial equipment which had not been removed by the retreating Soviet armies was stolen or destroyed by the Nazis. The deserters who wished to fight with the Nazis against Stalin would have been welcomed by many German army officers, but their use in this fashion was generally discouraged and frequently forbidden by the Nazi political leaders, such as Hitler or Himmler. In spite of this, some Russian units in the Nazi armies were formed, although generally they were used only for guard or garrison duties. The size of this movement of anti-Stalinist deserters can be judged from the fact that, in spite of the obstacles we have mentioned, the number of such deserters serving in the Nazi armed forces reached 900,000 in June 1944. These were nominally under the leadership of a renegade Soviet general, A.A. Vlasov, who had served as Soviet military advisor under Chiang Kai-shek in China in 1938. With the rank of Major General, and had been captured by the Nazis when serving as deputy commander of the Volkhov Front in June 1942. Nothing effective could be done with the Vlasov formations because of the opposition to Hitler and Himmler. When Germany was clearly on the road to defeat in November 1944, Himmler withdrew his opposition and allowed Vlasov to issue a call for an anti-Stalin liberation army of Russians. In 6 weeks, this organization received 1 million applications for membership, but could obtain almost no equipment and could organize combat units of no more than 50,000 men. At the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of Vlasov's supporters fled westward to the American and British armies for refuge from Stalin's vengeance, but were handed over to the Soviet Union to be murdered out of hand or sent to slave labor camps in Siberia, the gulags. The dimensions of human suffering involved in this whole situation is beyond the human imagination. The number of Soviet prisoners captured by the Nazis, according to the records of the German army, reached over 2 million by November 1st, 1941, and reached 3 million by March 1st, 1942. Over 500,000 of these died of starvation, typhus, or froze to death in the prison camps in the winter of 1941 to 1942. In the whole Eastern Campaign up to January 1944, the Nazis captured 5,500,000 prisoners, almost 6 million. On November 6, 1941, in Directive Number 35, Hitler suddenly accepted the suggestions of his generals and ordered an attack on Moscow. After 2 weeks of reorganization of forces, this attack began. About the same time, Leningrad was encircled, thus commencing an unsuccessful siege which continued until the city was relieved 28 months later. By October 8, 1941, 2 great encirclements west of Moscow closed on 650,000 Soviet prisoners with 5,400 cannons and 1,200 tanks. Mopping up took 2 weeks. By that time, the weather had broken, and the Germans were advancing through pouring rain, sleet, and mud. They suffered their first cases of frostbite on November 7th, but with Moscow only 38 miles away, the attack continued. A week later, Siberian divisions moved from the Far East in consequence of the Japanese-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, and Richard Sorg's information that the Japanese had decided to attack Singapore rather than Siberia appeared before Moscow. The first Soviet counteroffensive came on November 28th, just as the 2nd German Armored Division caught sight of the towers of the Kremlin from a distance of 14 miles. The next night, the temperature fell to 22 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The Germans, without any preparation for winter campaign, began to suffer horribly. Yet when Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group South, allowed some of his units to withdraw, he was removed by Hitler. On December 19th, the commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, was relieved and his post taken by Hitler himself. The Führer issued an order which said, "The army is not to withdraw a single step. Every man must fight where he stands." A few days later, Guderian was removed for violation of this order. In spite of Hitler's attitude, Russian pressure throughout the winter made necessary one German withdrawal after another, By the spring of 1942, many units had fallen back 100 or more miles. During this period, the Luftwaffe generally could not prepare for lack of winter lubricants, and when its planes did take to the air, they had to be used to carry supplies to ground forces, which were cut off by Russians. Tanks could only be used after their engines had been warmed up for 12 hours. Frostbite casualties in the German army ran about 1,000 a day, and by February 28, 1942, the total German casualties in the Russian offensive reached over 1 million, which was 31% of the army. We have mentioned that military assistance to the Soviet Union from the United States was held up by the slowness of the American economic mobilization, the anti-Bolshevism of American public opinion, and the general lack of confidence in Soviet ability to withstand the Nazi attack. These obstacles were not decisive with Churchill or Roosevelt. On July 12, 1941, Britain signed an alliance with Russia. 4 weeks later, Harry Hopkins returned from a hurried visit to Moscow to report to the Atlantic Conference his conviction that the Soviet Union would be able to hold out against the Nazi attack. He also brought a completely unreasonable demand from Stalin for an immediate British invasion of Western Europe to relieve the German pressure on Russia. Unable to grant any hopes of such an invasion in 1941 or even 1942, Roosevelt and Churchill decided to send a full-scale economic mission to Moscow to determine Russia's material needs. This mission, headed by Averell Harriman and Lord Beaverbrook, was in Moscow for 3 days at the end of September 1941 and signed an agreement for Soviet aid to June 30th, 1942. In the post-war period, it was frequently stated that the Roosevelt administration should have taken advantage of Stalin's urgent need for supplies in September 1941 by forcing him to sign agreements to recognize the independence and territorial integrity of various countries in Eastern Europe. Strangely enough, during the discussions in Moscow at the time, Stalin was eager to obtain a formal statement on war aims and on specific territorial boundaries, but the United States was reluctant. It objected to any secret accords which might hamper freedom of action later, and was unwilling to abandon the peoples of Eastern Europe to Russia or to insist on their rights vigorously enough to drive the Soviet Union to make a separate peace with Hitler. Such a separate peace was quite out of the realm of possibility, but no agreements about boundaries and governments made in 1941 could have been enforced against the Soviet Union 4 years later after these areas had fallen under Soviet military occupation. The agreement of September 30th, 1941 provided that in the next 9 months, the Anglo-Americans would send the Soviet Union 1 million tons of supplies, including 300 fighting planes, 100 bombers, and 500 tanks a month. Up to that moment, Russia had purchased about $100 million worth of supplies in the United States with its own money, had obtained 29 million in supplies from the United States loans to be repaid in future deliveries of gold bullion, and had obtained from Britain considerable supplies including 450 planes, 3 million pairs of boots, 22,000 tons of rubber. But financing the new Moscow Agreement was quite a different task, and could be done only under Lend-Lease. By the end of November, Roosevelt was able to get American public opinion, and especially American Catholic opinion, to reduce its objections to such a step sufficiently to allow him to establish it. As with Lend-Lease aid to Britain, such aid to Soviet Russia raised the problem of how supplies could be delivered. In the first 2 years of Lend-Lease, 46% of the total shipped went across the Pacific to Siberia in Soviet ships, 23% took the 76-day route to the Persian Gulf to go north over the completely inadequate Trans-Iranian route, 41% took the 12-day sea route to Murmansk or Archangel. The dangers of this last route can be seen from the fact that 21% of the cargoes on it were lost by German attack, partly by submarines and surface raiders, but chiefly by air attacks from Finnish and Norwegian bases. The horrors of this northern route to Russia are almost beyond description. In the summer, 24 hours of light each day allowed attacks to be continuous. In the winter, water temperature was so low that torpedoed seamen could survive no more than a few minutes in it. And in both seasons, there was no relief at the end of the voyage, for the Russian ports were within easy bombing range of German air bases under conditions of visibility, notably surrounding hills and poor Soviet cooperation, which allowed only a few seconds warning before any attack. Okay. The next section is section 15. I don't know if I can start that. Oh, it's going to be super long. Alright, I'll start a little bit of it. Okay, so the next section is section 15, World War II, the ebb of aggression, 1941 to 1945. The rising sun in the Pacific to 1942. The turning tide, 1942 to 1943. Midway, El Alamein, French Africa, and Stalingrad. Closing in on Germany, 1943 to 1945. Closing in on Japan, 1943 to 1945. All right. The Rising Sun in the Pacific to 1942. It's on page 731. Traditionally, American policy in the Far East had sought to preserve the territorial integrity and political independence of China and to maintain an open door for China's foreign trade. These goals became increasingly difficult to achieve in the course of the 20th century because of the growing weakness of China itself, the steady growth of aggression in Japan, and the deepening involvement of other powers with Far Eastern interests in a life-or-death struggle with Germany. After the fall of France, the Low Countries in the summer of 1940, Britain could offer the United States little more than sympathy and some degree of diplomatic support in the Far East, while the Netherlands and France, with rich colonial possessions within reach of Japan's avid grasp, could provide no real opposition to Japan's demands. After Hitler's attack on Russia in June 1941, the Soviet Union, which had actually fought Japanese forces in the Far East in 1938 and again in 1939, could exert no pressure on Japan to deter further Nipponese aggression. Thus, by the summer of 1941, Japan was ready for new advances in the Far East, and only the United States was in a position to resist. This situation was complicated by the domestic political divisions within the United States and Japan. In general, these divisions tended to postpone any showdown between the two powers. On the one hand, the American government had developed a fissure between its military strategic plans and its diplomatic activities, just at the time when isolationist opinion within the country was making its most vociferous objections to the administration's policies in both these fields. On the other hand, the Japanese government was by no means united either on direction or on the timing of its next moves. The divisions in public opinion within the United States and even within the Roosevelt administration are obvious enough to Americans, but the equally great divisions in Japan are largely ignored. It should be recognized by Americans today, as it was recognized by the Japanese leaders at the time, that the Japanese aggressions of 1941, which culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, were based on fear and weakness and not arrogance and strength. To be sure, the earlier aggressions, which began in Manchuria in 1931 and in North China in 1937, had been arrogant enough. The Japanese had been supremely confident of their ability to conquer all China, if necessary, even as late as 1939. As a consequence, their advance had been accompanied by brutality against the Chinese, by various actions to drive all Europeans and all European economic enterprises out of China, and by insults and humiliations to Europeans found in China, especially in Shanghai. By 1939, all of this was beginning to change. The attack on China had bogged down completely. The Japanese economy was beginning to totter under a combination of circumstances, including the exhausting effort to strangle China and to administer a fatal blow to the retreating Chinese government by octopus tactics, the reorganization of Japan's home industry from a light basis to a heavy industrial plant for which Japan lacked the necessary resources, the gigantic capital investments in Manchuria and North China, the growing restrictions on Japanese trade imposed by Western countries, and finally, the combination of a rapidly growing population with acute material shortages. Problems such as these might have driven many nations, even in the West, to desperate action. In Japan, the situation was made more critical by the large-scale diversion of manpower and resources from consumption to capital formation at a very high rate. And finally, all of this was taking place in a country which placed a high esteem on military arrogance. In theory, of course, Japan might have sought to remedy its material shortages in a peaceful way by seeking to increase Japan's foreign trade, exporting increasing amounts of Japanese goods to pay for rising Japanese imports. In fact, such a policy had obvious weaknesses. The World Depression after 1929 and the growth of economic autarky in all countries, including the United States, made it very difficult to increase Japanese exports. The excessively high American Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, also not so intended, seemed to the Japanese to be an aggressive restriction on their ability to live. The imperial preference regulations of the British Commonwealth had similar consequences. Since Japan could not defend itself against such economic measures, it resorted to political measures. To do otherwise would have been contrary to Japanese traditions, but by embarking on this course, Japan was heading in a direction which could hardly have been a favorable outcome. which could hardly have a favorable outcome. If Japan adopted political measures to defend itself against economic restrictions, the Western powers would inevitably defend themselves with even greater economic restrictions on Japan, driving Japan by a series of such stages to open war. And in such a war, in view of its economic weakness, Japan could hardly hope to win. These stages were confused and delayed over a full decade of years, 1931 to 1941, by indecision and divided councils in both Japan and the Western powers. In the process, Japan found a considerable advantage in the parallel aggressions of Italy and Germany. It also found a considerable disadvantage in the fact that Japan's imports were vital necessities to her, while her exports were vital necessities to no one. This meant that Japan's trade could be cut off or reduced by anyone, to Japan's great injury, but at much smaller cost to other nations. The steps leading to open war between Japan and the Western powers were delayed by the long-drawn indecision of the Sino-Japanese War. For years, Japan hoped to find a solution for its economic and societal problems in a decisive victory over China, while in the same years the Western powers hoped for an end to the Japanese aggression by a Japanese defeat in China. Instead, the struggle in that area dragged on without a decision. The Western powers were too divided at home and among themselves, too filled with pacifism and mistaken political and economic ideas to do anything decisive about China, especially when open war was impossible and anything less than war would injure China as well as Japan. Thus, no sanctions were imposed on Japan for its aggressions on Manchuria in 1931 or for its attack on North China in 1937. The American Neutrality Act was not applied to this conflict because President Roosevelt adopted the simple legalistic expedient of failing to find a war in the Far East. But the mere existence of laws which might have imposed economic sanctions or economic retaliation on Japan revealed to that country the basic weakness of its own position. In 1937, Japan received a series of lessons in the precarious state of its strategic economic position. In the first half of that year, as background for its growing military pressure on China, Japan brought a record amount of American scrap iron and steel, 1.3 million metric tons, in 6 months. Agitation to curtail this supply, either by applying the Neutrality Act to the Sino-Japanese conflict or by some lesser action, was growing in the United States. Early in October 1937, President Roosevelt caused a controversy by a speech suggesting a quarantine of aggressor nations. Sanctions. Isolationist sentiment in the United States, especially in the Midwest, was too strong to allow the administration to take any important steps towards such a quarantine. Nevertheless, Stimson, who had been an American Secretary of State at the time of the Manchurian crisis in 1931, made a public appeal for an embargo on the shipment of war materials to Japan. A month later, November 3rd through 24th, 1937, a conference of the signers of the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922, which guaranteed the integrity of China, met at Brussels to discuss what steps might be taken to end Japan's aggression in China. There was a considerable talk of economic sanctions, but no great power was willing to light the fuse on that stick of dynamite. So the occasion lapsed and nothing was done. But the lesson was not wasted on Japan. It intensified its efforts to build up Japanese power to a position where it could use political action to defend itself against any economic reprisals. Naturally, the political actions it took in this direction served only to hasten economic reprisals against itself, especially by the United States, the world's most devoted defender of the status quo in the Far East, and the only great power in any position, especially after Hitler's attacks, to adopt an active policy against Japan. Japan could have achieved little towards a political solution of its problems if it had not been for the aggression of Italy and Germany on the other side of the world. A full year before the Brussels Conference, on November 25, 1936, Japan had joined the League of Aggressors known as the Anti-Comintern Pact. Discussions seeking to strengthen this arrangement into a full German-Japanese alliance went on for years, but were not concluded until September 1940. Hitler was not sure whether he wanted Japanese support against the Western democracies or against the Soviet Union, and, accordingly, sought an agreement which could be swung either way, while Japan was interested in a German alliance only if it ran against the Soviet Union. At the same time, Germany objected to the Japanese war on China, since this prevented Japan's strength from being directed against either of Germany's possible foes and jeopardized German economic interest in China. All these difficulties continued, although Ribbentrop's advent of the post of foreign minister in Berlin in February 1938 inaugurated a period of wholehearted cooperation with Japan in China, replacing Neurath's earlier efforts to maintain some kind of neutral balance in the Sino-Japanese War. The German military advisors with Chiang Kai-shek were withdrawn, although some of them had been in their positions for 10 years and were likely to be replaced by Soviet advisors. The German ambassador was withdrawn from China, and the protection of German interests was generally left to lesser officers using Japanese officials in areas under Japanese occupation. The Japanese regime in Manchukuo was explicitly reorganized February 20th, 1938. All shipments of German war materials to China, which reached a value of almost 83 million marks in 1937, were ended, and incompleted contracts totaling 282 million marks were canceled. The Japanese claimed that their attack on nationalist China was really an anti-communist action, although recognized as a fraud in Berlin, was tacitly accepted, and the earlier German efforts to mediate peace between China and Japan ceased. In spite of these concessions, Japan continued its efforts to curtail German economic enterprises in China, along with those other Western nations. The alienation of these two aggressor countries by the summer of 1939 can be judged by the fact that the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939 was made in flagrant violation of the German-Japanese Anti-Comintern Agreement of November 1936. Since this latter document bound the signers to make no political agreements with the Soviet Union without the previous consent of the other signatory state. This was regarded in Tokyo as such a blow to the prestige of the Japanese government that the Prime Minister resigned. In the meantime, the American government began to tighten the economic pincers on Japan, just as Japan was seeking to tighten its military pincers on China. In the course of 1939, Japan was able to close all of the routes from the outside into China except through Hong Kong, across French Indochina, and along the rocky and undeveloped route from Burma to Chongqing. The American government retaliated with economic warfare. In June 1938, it established a moral embargo sanctions on the shipment of aircraft or their parts and bombs to Japan by simply requesting American citizens to refuse to sell these articles. Early in 1939, large American and British loans to China sought to strengthen that country's collapsing financial system. In September 1939, Washington gave the necessary 6-month notice to cancel the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan. This opened the door to all kinds of economic pressure against Japan. At the same time, the moral embargo was extended to 11 named raw materials which were vital to Japan's war machine. In December, this embargo was extended to cover light metals and all machinery or plans for making aviation gasoline. In general, there was a considerable pressure in the United States, both inside the administration and elsewhere, to increase American economic sanctions against Japan. Such a policy was opposed by the isolationists in the country, by our diplomatic agents in Tokyo, and by our quasi-alliant allies, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. These diverse opinions agreed that economic sanctions could be enforced in the long run only by war. To put it bluntly, if Japan could not get petroleum, bauxite, rubber, tin by trade, it could be prevented from seizing areas producing these products only by force. To avoid this obvious inference, Cordell Hull sought to make America's economic policy ambiguous so that Japan might be deterred from evil actions by fear of sanctions not yet imposed, and won to conciliatory actions by hopes of concessions not yet granted. Wow, that's a strategy. They're like, we won't tell them anything and we'll make them think that we're going to help them, or we might make them think that we might punish them so they don't know what to do. They'll just be confused. Such a policy was a mistake, but it obtained President Roosevelt's explicit approval in December 1939. It was a mistake since it paralyzed the less aggressive elements in Japanese affairs, allowing the more aggressive elements to take control because the uncertainty it engendered became so unbearable to many, even of the less aggressive, that any drastic action seeking to end the strain became welcome. There was no real faith in America's intentions, with the result that the period of sustained uncertainty came to be interpreted in Japan as a period of American rearmament preliminary to an attack on Japan, and the ambiguity of American commercial policy towards Japan was, over the months of 1940 to 1941, slowly resolved in the direction of increasing economic sanctions. There was already a steady increase in America's economic pressure on Japan by extensions of the moral embargo, by the growth of financial obstacles, and by increasing purchasing difficulties, presumably based on America's rearmament program. Japan continued to advance in China with brusque disregard of Western interest, citizens, or property. By the end of 1939, Japan controlled all the chief cities, rivers, valleys, and railroad lines of eastern China, but faced constant guerrilla opposition in rural areas and had no control over the deep interior of China, which remained loyal to Chiang Kai-shek's government in far-off Chongqing on the upper Yangtze in southwestern China. In March 1940, the Japanese set up a puppet Chinese government in Nanking, but the reality of its power deceived no one. In the winter of 1939 to 1940, Japan began to make vigorous commercial demands on the Netherlands East Indies. These demands, chiefly concerned with petroleum and bauxite, were increased after the German victories in France and the Low Countries. From these victories and from Hull's doctrinary refusal to encourage any Japanese hope that they could win worthwhile American concessions from a more moderate policy, the advocates of extremism in Japan gained influence. A Japanese demand was made on France following the latter's defeat by Germany to allow Japanese troops to enter northern Indochina in order to cut off supplies going to China. This was conceded at once by the Vichy government. At the same time, June 1940, Britain received a demand to withdraw its troops from Shanghai and to close the Burma Road to Chinese imports. When Hull refused to cooperate with Britain, either in forcing Japan to desist or in any policy aiming to win better Japanese behavior by concessions, Britain withdrew from Shanghai and closed the Burma Road for 3 months. Just at that moment, a powerful new weapon against Japan was added to the American arsenal by an amendment to the National Defense Act, giving the President authority to embargo the export of supplies which he judged to be necessary to the defense of the United States. The first presidential order under this new authority required licenses for many goods which Japan needed, including aluminum, airplane parts, all arms or ammunition, optical supplies, and various strategic materials, but left petroleum and scrap iron unhindered. As France was falling in June 1940, Roosevelt, for reasons of domestic policy, added to his cabinet 2 leaders of the Republican Party, Henry L. Stimson and Frank C. Knox. Both of these were interventionists in behalf of Britain, while Stimson for years had been demanding economic sanctions against Japan, assuring the more cautious of his audience that such a policy would bring about a Japanese retreat rather than any war. The error in this point of view was clearly revealed at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, but the exact nature of this error is not always recognized. The real error in the American negotiation with Japan in 1940 to 1941 was a double one. On the one hand, there was no correlation between our demands on Japan and our actual power in the Pacific, since our demands were vastly more extensive than our strength. On the other hand, there was no correlation between our strategic plans and our diplomatic activity, with the consequence that there was no correlation between our German policy and our Japanese policy. The American strategic plans were based on the premise that Germany must be defeated before Japan. From this perfectly correct premise followed several corollaries which were not fully grasped by American leaders, especially by the non-military leaders. One of these corollaries provided that America must not get into war with Japan before it got into war with Germany, for if it did, it would either have to abandon its strategic plans and proceed to fight Japan or declare war on Germany itself. The much greater danger from Germany, and especially from a German victory over either Britain or the Soviet Union, made the first of these unacceptable, while the American public opinion would never have accepted an American declaration of war against Germany when we were already in a state of war with Japan. A second corollary from all of these conditions was that American diplomatic pressure on Japan must be timed in terms of American-German relations and not in terms of American-Japanese relations in order to avoid pushing Japan into a desperate action before American-German relations had passed the breaking point. As we shall see, American diplomatic pressure on Japan was increased on the basis of moral outrage, high-flown principles, incidental retaliation, and an unrealistic conception of international legality without any attempt to coordinate this pressure either with our relations to Germany or, what was even worse, with our actual power in the Pacific. Hull was able to do this because his attitudes were generally shared by the civilian heads of the two service departments, by Stimson as Secretary of War and by Knox as Secretary of the Navy. Thus, the more realistic views of the military and naval leaders and their better appreciation of the implications of America's strategic plans did not have their proper weight on America's policymaking on the cabinet level or even at the White House. Fortunately, America was saved from many of the consequences of these errors when Hitler made his greatest mistake by declaring war on the United States. All right, I'm just going to stop reading there. That kind of makes sense. I mean, basically, it just seems like everybody just wanted to go to war, and they're just trying to figure out ways to, like, make excuses for them to go to war. They're like, whoa, we'll wait for Germany to wipe out Russia, and then we'll go in, and then we'll attack Japan after they're all weak and tired. It's like that thing that Alex Jones always talks about that James Bond episode with the Siamese fighting fish, where the one Siamese fighting fish waits in the corner for the other two to fight each other, and then when the winner of the first fight is like completely like beat up and tired and barely won the first fight, then the third one just floats over and just like you're done. It kind of seems like they're all trying to employ that strategy of letting the other two groups fight each other until they're completely like worn each other out in a war of attrition or an actual battle, and then they just kind of waltz in at the end after both groups have pretty much completely destroyed each other, and then they just clean up all the stuff at the end. And that seems like that's what everybody's plan was like, oh, we'll just wait for Germany's like, we'll just wait for France and like Eastern Europe to like kill each other, and then we'll come in. And then Britain's like, we'll just wait for France and Germany to kill each other, and then we'll come in. And America's like, we'll just wait for Germany and Russia to kill each other, and then we'll come in. Right? That's what it seems like everyone's planning. I could be wrong there. I might be misinterpreting the book. So, that's the video for today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this anyway. So, have a good day and peace.